This is part two of the video for the North Dakota State group for March 23rd. I had prepared for your meeting a PowerPoint presentation which hopefully can be shown in conjunction with this, and I just want to explain the slides, which I can't show obviously on this medium, but at least I can explain what the slides are. There's over 20 of them, and I'll go through them quite quickly, but hopefully they will make more sense if I explain what they are here. The first slide is the blog post that led to this invitation indirectly from outsidethewalls.org/blog. It's my blog, and the blog post is for September 5th, 2010. You can see it on the internet if you wish. And it talks about my close encounter with the Ross Mosque 57 years earlier. The second slide is of Ross in northwest North Dakota. We lived there from 1953 to 54, my 8th grade year. In that year, this was before the Grand Forks and Minot Air Force bases had been constructed. North Dakota, rural North Dakota at the time had more population than it does today, but even so, these were tiny little towns, and Ross was no different. The third slide, if you look for number 5, that's me. I was a hotshot basketball player as an 8th grader. First game I scored 34 points, the second game 32, and then I became a human being. At the far left in the kneeling is my friend Emmett's cousin, I believe Joe, who was a little older than me, I believe, and in that little school. He was part of the Muslim community of Ross. The next slide is from 1994 of the Ross School. My parents were both school teachers in that school. Emmett and I were in 7th and 8th grade together in the room that's closest to the camera on the 2nd floor. My mother was a teacher, our teacher in that year. To the right is a building that's being torn down. Again, this is 1994. This was the house that 7 of us lived in. It was 2 rooms with a kitchen. This was a terrible time to find housing in western North Dakota because of the first oil boom in the Williston Basin, in which Ross and the area was part. So we lived together in that little tiny house and used the school for things like telephone and showering and things of that nature. But I want you to notice this school because it comes up again. It was built in 1908. Next slide is of my parents, probably at the high school prom in the spring of 1954 in Ross. My mother and my dad, Esther and Henry. Esther was Emmett and my teacher, and my father was the superintendent of the school, which perhaps had 5 teachers at the time. I was noticing when I looked at the picture again that my dad at that time, in 54, was younger than my oldest son is today. You start to feel old after a while. I don't have any pictures of Emmett from those early years, my friend. The next slide is from 1997, and it's a picture of Emmett. Emmett told me a while ago that he was at the age of 13, the age that we were in 8th grade, he had to become responsible for the farm work because his dad had become ill, couldn't do the farm work. So he didn't have much time for social activity. But he was a nice guy, and we saw each other each day in school. And uh, he later became a very successful engineer for a major aircraft company. He still works there. The graduate of North Dakota State University in aeronautical engineering. This is on next slide is my dad's report, and if you look at Emmett's name beside it, you see handwritten Muhammad. I asked Emmett, and that's the only way I ever knew him, why was he called Muhammad or not called Muhammad? And he said it was his mother's strategic decision. And even then, there was some sensitivity about this religion issue. On that list, 2 of the 5 seniors were the Muslim of the Muslim community in Ross, and at least 1 of the 8th graders, and perhaps 2, were Muslims. Large numbers. The next slide is of an early group of the Syrian men. They were actually from Lebanon, border area, I guess. And they were very unique. They came about in 1902, and they would have been in that community by 1908 when that school was built. So the school picture that you saw before probably represents a building that they were involved in building. I don't know if the building still exists. Next slide is of the place in Lebanon from which they came. In general, I think I'm pretty close to Beirut. And this was the famous mosque, the next slide. And here, the next slide is Emmett and some of his relatives in 2007 at a reunion which I attended. The next slide is a picture of the mosque today, part of a cemetery. If you look straight forward, you'll see the town of Ross about 2 or 3 miles away. If you would look to the left of the camera, down the road about 2 miles is where Emmett and his family lived. To the right about a half mile or so, Highway 2, the major U.S. Highway 2. The next slides are inside the mosque. The picture, the second from the right-hand picture, third down, is Emmett's mother, and he told me that she was instrumental in having the mosque built. She took this quite seriously. The next slides are 2 gravestones in the cemetery, right outside the mosque. The next slide shows all of the places that we lived in North Dakota. We were not, no place in North Dakota was our hometown. We always were moving. I lived in 8 of these towns, we, as a consequence, we got to see more of the flavor of relationships, perhaps, than the people who grew up in these places, because we were always coming in as strangers. North Dakotans are good people, but in the 50s and in the 40s, and today I would guess the same, there was problems of intolerance that had to be dealt with, which we didn't deal with well. The next picture is of a nun. For instance, at one point in time, there was anti-garb laws in North Dakota where a nun in garb could not teach in a public school. I was going to leave, have a table with the affirmation of human oneness. Like, obviously, I'm not there. The next slide is from that booklet. This has become a passion of mine. At 1,000,000copies.info is where you can see this affirmation of human oneness in 40 some languages now. Take a look. 1,000,000copies.info. Finally, there's a slide at the very end about Wally's Donuts. And I'm going to just ask you to read that blog post on March 23rd and hopefully take some positive action. I am going to take some positive action. The story is in the blog post. Thank you very much. Work for tolerance and understanding.